Greetings from the Dark Continent, Conscious Caracal here. And tonight I have my highest profile guest yet on Stream of Consciousness, Styxhexenhammer. And we will be talking about and in detail unpacking the socialist utopia called South Africa. And now I'm going to hand over the mic to Styx so he can give you just a little idea of who he is and what he's all about and why you should care.
All right, well, thank you for having me on, first and foremost. I look forward to our conversation. I'm a political YouTuber primarily. I write books. I am on other sites now, branching out into alt-tech bitch. I happen to believe strongly in individuality. Sometimes I get called a Nazi, but that's by BuzzFeed, so, you know, they're commies and it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's the thing. You shouldn't let labels really stick to you. I mean, they're going to call you a Nazi and a white supremacist no matter what. So you might as well just let it roll off you like water off a duck's back.
Yeah, that's been happening for a number of years, ever since the corporations stopped wanting to compete with people like us.
Well, they're going to have to start paying attention because we're the new threat now. They're degrading while we're rising, and we as in alternative media.
Yeah, the growth is massive. I think it's presumably worldwide, because I know you're in South Africa. I'm actually wondering, and I wanted to ask you this, have you noticed sort of a taking off of the alternative tech, alt opinion, alt politics sort of thing there? Because yeah. I'd actually like to know that.
I had a conversation with, who was it? I talked to the Renegade Report, who is they are the biggest political podcast in South Africa, and we talked about the idea of alternative media rising in South Africa. And the interesting thing that I noticed is with the land expropriation vote happening at the beginning of the year, when they said basically, okay, we're going to send this now to the Con Court, and they're going to decide whether this is constitutional or not. People started realizing it's almost like that metaphor of the frogs in the boiling water. They started realizing the water started getting a bit hot. So people took to Twitter and took to social media to voice their opinions. And I've definitely seen in my personal experience a very large increase in people just maybe not setting up their own podcasts or creating their own shows or websites, but rather just people going on Twitter and voicing their opinions and actually pushing back against the mainstream media narrative and just all the fucking lies and fake news that are out there, which I think is very important for South Africa. But the movement in terms of alternative media is still in its fetal or like fetus stage. So it's very young, but it's developing very fast, and I'm very encouraged by that. But at the same time, it's not nearly at the stage where it is already in America and England, because at the same time, we don't have the same internet infrastructure or internet culture that you have over there in first world countries.
I think it might end up ahead of England's, considering the direction they're going in. It is interesting, though, to think of a court being able to rule on whether a government can confiscate your land without even paying you for it. And it's a very strange concept, I will admit, as an American.
Well, we've seen it happen in Zimbabwe, so it's not outside of the realm of the imagination. You can basically see what happens, but we're still going to try it because this time it's going to be different.
Yeah, people won't starve at all. I wonder if they've thought about the fact that it'll cause millions of black people to starve.
It's at the moment it's the white man that's making black people starve and unemployed, so they don't worry about that because we're going to bring in the second coming of communist Jesus.
I eagerly await Hillary Clinton condemning the acts there. The xenophobia.
No, just watch. If, let's say, for example, worst case scenario, South Africa goes the way of Zimbabwe, we're going to have all these platitudes of, oh, if only we knew, if only someone told us. And I'm not going to allow them to do that. And I think South Africans are going to allow the mainstream media or foreign politicians to get away with that rhetoric for a second time. Because we've been warning you in ample amounts.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, you have something similar vaguely in Venezuela, where they constantly expropriate corporate property and nationalize things, and with the same result. So it's an interesting feature of some of these governments around the world.
Yeah, well, I think the thing about South Africa is our constitution is almost like a neoliberal darling across the world. Everyone always raves about how amazing our constitution is. And then now, basically, what's the point of a constitution if the government gets a majority vote and they can just change whatever they want?
Yeah, the constitution here is great. It's just we don't follow it. But remember, Nelson Mandela, just recite his name, and then you can't criticize.
It's just a magic word that makes everything just perfect and peachy.
Yeah,
But
I do have to say some of the music about the struggle there was pretty good.
And then also the Antwoord.
Yeah. Yes.
No, the thing that I love about South Africa is just the culture in general. Because I will admit, one of the things about living in a cultural melting pot is that you do get a lot of exposure to different viewpoints and different cultures and different ways of living. From a personal standpoint, that's very enriching. But from a broader picture in terms of long term, it brings with it a lot of other problems as well.
Yeah, that's happening here too. Like there are definitely benefits to having, multiple cultures living side by side, but the instability, I've noticed, I wonder if it's there. It's not so much that the little people like detest one another for some tribal or feudal reason. It's people in the government have a reason to split people up along some line, socioeconomic, racial, ethnic, whatever, in order to gain votes, basically. It's becoming an enormous problem here. I think it's beginning to break down, though, honestly, and go back to sort of how it was in the 90s, where a lot of people just didn't give a hell.
But I think, and this is just my personal views, I think multicultural societies make identity politics almost inevitable.
Yeah.
Because people, if you just look at the past, is a great teacher. And if you look at the past, as soon as you get to a point where you have multiple factions that are divided by superficial things like skin color or basically hair color or whatever, then you start getting tribal mentality of we need to stick together with people that we like.
Yeah.
Or people that look like us. But that's human nature. Humans have in-group preference. And I think it was when I read The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, he said that even albinos have in-group preference in terms of they're much more, they did studies where it showed that even an albino person is much more inclined to help another albino person just because they look like them.
Yeah. Well, yeah, humans are highly visual. And I think when people talk, it's like here the postmodernists are trying to say race doesn't exist. But the thing is, they're looking at their sort of newish definition of race as being like subspecies or something, but it's just phenotypical. It's just a small set of genes that happen to affect a person's like skin color or something that tend to be common to a group. They think that if you actually believe in that aspect of genetics that's demonstrably true, that you attach some larger cultural or moral meaning to it, and that you think, well, I'm better than this person because of the color of their skin. They're warping it out of all context.
Yeah, but that's how humans developed. I mean, it makes sense that if these people arrive from over the mountains and they come over to your tribe and they don't look like you, they're probably from some other foreign culture. And if you know human history, they're probably here to enslave or kill you.
Yeah. Yeah, or over time, if people come to different understandings about one another, they can applaud one another's own capabilities and sort of hold one another up. Like back in Greece, you have the different tribes there, vaguely different. And it's like, well, this tribe, they're the best shipbuilders, and these guys run the fastest, and those guys have the most wives and stuff. It's actually kind of interesting to think of.
Yeah, but I think, and like I said in the sound check before we went live, in this strong emphasis on if civil war breaks out in South Africa, the sides will not be defined by race. It will be very loosely defined, but it will be more defined by culture. You will have different cultures that stick together because they share values, and then they'd stand a better chance fighting against the plethora of other groups and factions that would arise within such a scenario.
Yeah. I think that's the way it would be here almost too. It's like you may have seen the images from the Confederate statue stuff where you have black people holding Confederate flags and saying, yeah, I have no problem with it. And then meanwhile, you have plenty of people who are white and they're like, well, no, it's totally unacceptable. I choose to differentiate from like the alt-right and some groups like that. I don't think there will ever be a race war in the United States. I just don't think it'll happen. I think culture is a stronger glue for people.
Yeah, and you can, well, and this is only my personal experience, but I grew up in a town that was 80% colored. So I've grew up my entire life. I've been a racial and a cultural minority. But in that town, because now for context for our international listeners, in South Africa, there's a distinct ethnic difference between a colored person and a black person. So the colored ethnicity in South Africa, they speak the same language as the Boers and the Afrikaners. They speak Afrikaans, which is also my language. So, and the interesting thing that I noticed was growing up in such a community, is that racial tensions are almost non-existent because of a shared language and a pretty similar culture that diffused most of the conflicts and problems that you usually get in a metropolitan area, where the cultures are just too different and they don't speak the same language, so they can't even deliberate or talk about what's bothering them. So just from my own personal experience, I've seen how culture and language can bind people together across racial lines.
Yeah. Now, is it economically speaking, I'm wondering this, on the ground, I mean, for the average person, is South Africa generally improving economically, or is it sliding backwards?
If you look empirically at the numbers and the stats, we're pretty much sliding backwards. I think the economy has shrunk, or we are growing at like 0.1%. Or I think last year we celebrated the fact that the economy in that year only grew 0%. Like, yes, we're not sliding backwards anymore. Everyone was popping the champagne bottles. Everyone like, is this really the best we can do? Is this how low we've basically set the bar?
Yeah.
But yeah, no,
it was funny. Yeah, it was funny because years ago I mentioned in passing, I think like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, that South Africa would be abused by BRICS, and that basically economically it wouldn't be very helpful. They'd basically just be a bunch of minerals being mined out for the Chinese or something.
Yeah, but that's the biggest for the raw minerals and the farming capabilities, basically. And
Putin needs his blood diamonds. Putin needs his blood diamonds.
They are one of the diamonds in the Queen's crown is like the Kimberley diamond, which is the biggest diamond that's ever been excavated in, I think, in the world or in South Africa. I'm talking under correction. But yeah, the thing about it's my own little conspiracy theory, and the fact that I think in the future China is going to utilize Africa as its breadbasket, because their agricultural soil is heavily degrading at a very alarming pace. They've already utilized, I think, the most of their agricultural land in terms of farms, but now the pollution is destroying that, so it's actually diminishing. So I think, and just my theory, in the future, they're probably interested in Africa as basically just being their breadbasket, so they can turn all their agricultural soil just into industry.
I think you're probably right. Maybe not all of it, but at least a portion, because they have been heavily moving into parts of East Africa. I know, aren't there political parties in some of those countries that are one platform movements, specifically just kick out China?
In our neighbor countries. In Namibia, which borders on South Africa, they've now built a military base. And there was the other day, I think a few months ago, there was a shipment of weapons that was, military vehicles that just came into a port in Namibia, and they just drove to Botswana. So there's definitely a Chinese presence here. There you can see the chess pieces moving, as I say. The grand game is afoot.
I think they built a base in Djibouti actually last year, or were planning to.
Yeah, no, I think they are well down the line in terms of developing it there. And another interesting thing I read the other day was they want to build a canal through Nicaragua now to rival.
Yeah, that fell through. That's not going to actually happen. They're never going to build it. They just used that as an excuse to put the base in, and then they basically screwed the Nicaraguans.
Well, on that note, something interesting happened. I think a few weeks ago, so where they wanted to build this canal initially, there was a nature reserve, and that stopped the development of this canal. But then a few weeks ago, miraculously, some protesters went there and just set the nature reserve ablaze. Very convenient.
Yeah, I wonder how much they were paid for that act.
No, Styx, it's completely organic. It's grassroots, man.
Yeah, it's this extremely rainy climate. There's just wildfires all the time for some reason. Yeah. But no, the Panama Canal, I think they're almost done as of 2020, doubling its capacity. I don't think there's going to be a need for a Nicaragua canal, honestly. I don't think it'll ever end up being built. They'll probably put in other projects, but they'll just build like hotels and stuff. And then they'll cancel the initial contract, and then they'll have a base there, basically.
Right. Now, a question I do have for you that I want to pick your brain on is on the topic of land expropriation. And can you give us an idea of, just from your own thoughts, on the importance of private property in terms of not just democracy, but also liberty and prosperity?
Yeah. If you don't have the ability to have private property, there is no liberty, because literally you're always going to be at someone else's whim for your very most rudimentary base level existence of simply having a place to lay your head at night. We have a problem here, at least I consider it a problem, a lot of people don't, is the fact that property taxes exist at all. I look at it and say, if you have a property tax, it's administered on the state level in most US states. You're paying rent to the government. Whereas if you go to like certain states, there is no property tax. I don't think Texas, for instance, has one. There are state taxes, you have to pay for certain services, but for the land itself, if you're not making use of any services at all, it'd basically just be paying pennies for road maintenance, and basically that's it. You could have solar cells, gather rainwater in some states anyway, and be your own person, be a survivalist. Now here in Vermont, though, there's property taxes, so you pay rent to the government there. You're talking about expropriation. That's even more draconian, though. That's saying, hey, we're going to take all or part of your productivity, despite the fact that we have no specific claim to it. Now, we're not even going to pay you for it. If it was like eminent domain here, the government at the very least will pay you for the land. Usually they'll pay you more than it's worth. I think we should have an amendment so that you get like 4 or 5 times the cost. They shouldn't be able to just pay you its fair market value. It should be considerably more, because it's an involuntary situation. But over there, it would be even worse, because you're not even getting like anything for it in most cases, right? They're talking about just literally confiscating like 90% of the farm.
It's literally the state coming over, knocking on your door and say, hey man, it's your lucky day. You're gonna have to you're gonna have a nice change of career, man. Let's go.
Have any of these farmers considered breaking parts of their land into lots and selling them preemptively to prevent the expropriation from happening?
I can't really say. I haven't really heard of anyone doing that, but I'm pretty sure people have considered that. I think the South African farmers are incredibly resourceful, so I would not be surprised if a lot of them are already planning that, have done that, or are considering it.
Yeah, that would be. I would think that. I mean, if they're legally capable of doing that, short of a civil war, I suppose that'd be the only other option.
Yeah, and so last night I watched Lauren Southern's Farmlands documentary, and an interesting thing that I found there was she interviewed a guy from the ANC, which is the ruling party in South Africa, and she asked him, "What are your thoughts on this land expropriation? Will it happen, and will it be within the confines of the law?" And he said, "No, people shouldn't worry. It will not be against the law, because we will change the constitution, so then it will not be unconstitutional. So everyone should just stay calm." Now, like, is this guy for real? Is this his message of calm? Is that, don't worry, we'll just change the law so then it won't be against the law, and then you won't have a problem.
The Democrats would love to do that here with the Second Amendment. No, we won't violate the Constitution. We're just going to strike out the second and make sure you can only have certain kinds of guns.
Yeah, so then the conservatives can be happy because it won't be against the Constitution. So
and like the cowards they are, a lot of them would accept it. I don't even think it would cause any real civil strife. I think they would honestly bend over in that situation just to avoid conflict, because they're so fearful.
Well,
they're so afraid of being called bigots.
Yeah, Styx, I have to tell you, man, you have to cherish that that First Amendment and Second Amendment of yours, man. Like, in South Africa, getting a gun is a bureaucratic nightmare. And they did a gun confiscation, I think, in the early 2000s. And from the guns that they confiscated, the police, the SAPs, they lost 40,000 of them. So those guns that they confiscated are now in criminal hands.
No, that's wonderful. So it's mostly like farmers there that have like maybe a shotgun or like an old hunting rifle, or are those more unregulated?
Yeah, there's still a problem. For example, I'm in the process of getting a gun now myself, but at the moment I just have a paintball gun and a gun that shoots lead pellets, which pretty much is a BB gun. Yeah, but like a high-powered BB gun that you can use basically to kill birds with. But you can take out someone's eye, or basically just keep them at a distance with it. So at the moment, that's my mode of defense, man. But
better than nothing.
I tweeted out.
Meanwhile, here I look at it as restrictive. Even Texas just legalized carrying swords around and shit.
I think you can carry a sword in South Africa, and people won't even look at you funny. The things I've seen as a South African just walking down the street, it'll amaze you. But you become desensitized to it.
That's actually great, because that's still a decent weapon, I guess. Carry a dirk around.
Just the other day, I tweeted out an image of a rape gate that we have in our house. So it's basically a gate in the middle of your house that separates the living quarters where you sleep from the rest of the house. So just to protect your family. And I captioned it, "This is my reality in South Africa. And don't worry, Europeans, you'll get used to it."
Yeah,
because
no,
that's what
they
happens.
probably will. That's the sad part.
Yeah, because then a lot of the South African lefties came after me and said, "Oh, this is a racist tweet. You're saying this because this is what happens when white people become a minority." I'm like, no, this is what happens when you give your government over to socialist kleptocrats, no matter the race. Like, this is what happens. It has nothing to do with race. It has everything to do with just fucking a terrible, morally bankrupt ideology.
That's one thing I don't get about some like the ethno-nationalistic groups here or elsewhere. It's like they think that if things were like just more white, they would magically get better. But the thing is, if you had a more authoritarian government, you still wouldn't be safe. Now they can come in with machine guns. It wouldn't just be like home invaders carrying a 9mm. It'd be 10 times worse, and they'd be unrestrained. You wouldn't have a constitutionalist system. Yeah.
But you have to, if you visit South Africa, if you talk to some South Africans on farms, for example, you'll see that they've become very ingenuitive in terms of defending themselves. Like, they no longer rely just on guns. Now you're going to have to work within the rules that have been set. So a lot of them have like booby traps and fucking paintball guns and all types of security theater and things going on to keep themselves safe. So even though it's a morbid thing, I still find it very interesting to see how ingenuitive people in South Africa have become in terms of keeping themselves safe.
It's like you go to the pet store. Hey, why did you come home with 20 dogs?
No, not fucking dogs, man. Like pet lions and cheetahs and caracals.
That'd be cool, actually, to see a bunch of people with pet lions and stuff. Here mostly it's pit bulls, but I think they're more aggressive than lions, probably. So they're more likely to randomly attack somebody.
I knew a guy a few years back that had a pet ostrich that kept his yard safe, bro.
Oh,
like
that's way worse than a lion.
Yeah. And what it's a bit off topic, but what a lot of people also do in terms of keeping their livestock safe, and I don't know if you do it in the US as well, is they keep a donkey there. So the donkey serves as like a noise system. So if something or someone sets foot in the pen where the animals are, the donkey makes a fucking loud noise, and it just attacks the person.
I don't know here. I mean, farmers here in Vermont, I mean, usually it's just cows and chickens for the most part, sometimes some goats. But I mean, a goat would be, I mean, if you're trying to break into someone's barn and the goat came for you, it'd probably be pretty bad. Don't you have a special, extremely large black variety of goat there too?
Not to my knowledge, no. I'm not very well versed in terms of the goat farming community in South Africa.
I thought there was a special South African breed that's like just gigantic, like you could ride it almost like a small horse or something, if I remember correctly, and I thought they looked pretty cool.
No, not to my knowledge, not where I grew up, but maybe in some other parts. But the interesting thing about South Africa in general is the fact that it's a world in a country. So a lot of people think that South Africa is just this place where everything is the same wherever you go. But it's such a large country. I think it's the size of like half of Europe. But the difference between the provinces is immense. For example, if you go up to KwaZulu-Natal, it's tropical, it's humid, it's very, the ocean is as hot as bathwater. Then you go to like the west coast and it's fucking desert and the water is ice cold. Or you come down to the Cape province where I live and the Western Cape where it's just winelands and mountains, and it's an incredibly diverse country in terms of biomes and geography and just sites that you can visit.
Yeah, it's too bad that a place that's large has a big population and obviously a lot of agricultural land and resources would be impoverished.
But at the same time, a lot of South Africa's land is not really suitable for agriculture because I think there's like a third of the country's desert. So everyone there just farms sheep, basically. So a lot of times when people bring up that stat of like I don't know, like 50% or 60% of the soil of the agricultural land is in white possession. I'm like, yeah, because a third of the country, the Northern Cape, is just a desert. It's a bunch of sheep farmers. So you just have a farm that's huge. And it's just desert, so the sheep just walk around there. And the average South African doesn't want to go farm there. So of course that's going to skew the numbers. Because there's a lot of big farms there specifically for sheep in the middle of nowhere. And
so
it's not arable.
South Africa competing with New Zealand.
Maybe in terms of the sheep farming, maybe not the sheep fucking though.
No.
Is that Wales?
No, probably. I don't know. Probably
so
both.
Now, I had an interesting question when I told one of my mates that you were coming on, and he said he wanted to ask you if South Africa, for example, goes the way of Venezuela or Zimbabwe, where it just completely collapses under its own socialist weight. Do you think the world would allow it to happen? Because at the moment, South Africa is like the last vestige of hope for neoliberalism in Africa. We are this diverse country in terms of we are the poster child of diversity. Do you think the world would intervene if such a collapse or crisis happens in terms of like Venezuela or Zimbabwe, or would they just let it happen?
Probably on behalf of the socialist government. Yeah, that's the problem. I don't think that they would intervene to save people, though. Not unless it was so butcherous and insane that it looked like it was going to spill out into neighboring countries and cause a continent-wide massive war or something. You know, because certain tribal groups within South Africa, they would also have brethren in nearby places too, right? So then that could definitely cause, you know, intertribal warfare across borders, especially where the borders are too weak to be defended.
Yeah, interesting thing that happened, I think, last year was when a lot of protests erupted in South Africa. The first thing, within days, the Botswana government closed their borders because they didn't want it to spread into their country.
Yes, I saw that with the xenophobic attacks. People couldn't understand it because it was like groups of Zulu nationals attacking other
foreigners, like Somalis and Kenyans and Nigerians.
Yeah, that was actually really interesting because I don't think a lot of people, well, if they saw the story at all, because our media, you know, they don't give a crap. If they saw it at all, they were like, well, this doesn't make any sense. They're all African. It's like so funny.
Yeah, but like I told you when we were doing the sound check before the show, a lot of foreigners have this view of South Africa in terms of all black South Africans are just this homogenous, agreeing mass of people. But that can't be further from the truth. Like, for example, we have 11 official languages, and within the black population, you have Zulus, you have Xhosas, you have Vendas, you have all these different factions that are definitely not going to just band together under a common flag. Like, they've been at war for hundreds of years. They're not just going to band together against a common foe, because they will probably fight each other for resources in the event of a civil war. Yeah.
See, try convincing a liberal here that that's the case. By the way, your moderator there, Catherine, brings up a good point that Venezuela has been given billions. So even if the world community did sort of band together and try to help South Africa if it were collapsing, it might not even help. Because if the underlying structure is run by inept socialists, I mean, you'd have to replace them first. Then it would be seen as a globalist coup, oddly enough. That might make it worse.
Well, that's what the Venezuelans basically did, was when the Hugo Chavez used it as an excuse. The fear of like American imperialists are why we are in the situation that we are now. The Americans and the Western world are conspiring against us. I mean, you got that exact same rhetoric in Zimbabwe as well, coincidentally, where as soon as the shit hits the fan, you just blame the foreign influence.
Yeah. Well, no, North Korea's done that too. It's like, well, everything would be great if it weren't for the Americans here preventing us from invading our neighbor.
But then at the same time, now you mentioned the xenophobic attacks in South Africa. Now, if you take into account that's black on black violence, now how do you think the natives would react against people that don't even look like them, people that look foreign? For example, now white South Africans that look European. I can't mention how many times I've been told to go back to Europe, but I can't. I'm 11th generation South African. My family's been here since 1688. I'm more African than European. I don't feel at home in Europe. I've been there. It doesn't feel like a place where I belong. I belong in Africa.
Yeah. Plus, Europe at this point is basically an extension of a caliphate in some cases, like the UK. I think, and then like Eastern Europe would be like a whole. I mean, imagine living in, after the climate you're used to with being more temperate. Imagine trying to live in the Baltics or northern Poland or Finland. You'd be so miserable you'd kill yourself probably. Like I got to go outside 10 days this year. It was so warm, man. Global warming.
Yeah, I think it is in England where there's like 3 days of sunshine during the winter.
Yeah.
And a lot of South African expats that go to England actually get depressed because they miss the South African weather. They miss the sun and basically being able to see blue skies.
You would hate
in
Vermont
England,
then. Vermont is more similar to England than it would be, yeah, or Scandinavia, Siberia.
Yeah. But yeah, that's the thing. You can't. It's easy for example, children to go over to another country in terms of when their parents immigrate. But it's easy to replant a small tree, but you can't ever properly replant a tree that's reached maturity. So most immigrants that from South Africa that go to Australia or New Zealand or England, they do it for their children. They don't do it for themselves. They're pretty much miserable there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd be miserable in England too at this point. That's like 10 years ago. I would have said it'd be on the short list of places I wanted to visit. Now it's like, yeah, I think I might be safer if I just go to backpacking in Afghanistan. Honestly,
yeah, you'd prefer not to be arrested by the SS there.
Yeah, and probably have more fun too. You buy a crate of grenades for $10. So
yeah, you go there into a field and you just create some little structures and you just fucking use some grenades and Molotovs and shit and go to town.
Yeah, you have opium and you have grenades. It's way better than England.
Sounds like a fucking great time.
Get a life, bend the knife.
Yeah, but another interesting thing about the third world or growing up in a third world country is the fact that I can see, well, what you see as social justice in America or in England it's a different magnitude over here. So interesting phenomenon is the fact that if you listen to, for example, to a lot of these activists or protesters, is they just parrot a lot of these mantras and slogans from America that originated on American campuses. For example, white privilege, Black Lives Matter, racism is prejudice plus power, whatever. And it's a foreign ideology. And a few weeks ago, oh no, it was a few days ago, UCT, the University of Cape Town, had an event where they had a persons of color only supper, and it caused a lot of uproar in on the South African social media, not in the media as much because the media kind of supports that thing. But the thing that I found interesting was the fact that then you look at the organizers of this persons of color only supper, and it's a white girl. And she can go because she's on their side. She's an ally. But the regular white people can't go. And then you just look at all the organizers, you look at their Twitter bios or at their background, and you see these people all have feminist or fucking Antifa or whatever hashtags and shit in their bios. And they're all made from the same cloth. They were made in the same factory. Like you can see
and the funny part is here they preface it when something like that happens. It's like, well, whites are the majority, so you're in power, so it's okay. There's no reverse racism. You're the majority group, and there it's like a tiny minority, and yet it still happens, and you're still racist if you think that it's slightly odd. Yeah, I just find it odd because I don't know about there, like you're like growing up in South Africa or something, but here when I grew up here in the United States, especially New England in the 90s, race was almost non-existent from public discourse in many cases, other than you'd say, well, the Klan, they're racist, and we're trying to prevent people from being lynched or whatever, even though the last lynching I think was over a decade ago. But for the most part, living as a kid, like if you saw someone and they were of a different race, you didn't think anything of it. It's like, oh, there's just another American. You didn't care. Like there was a family that briefly lived in the apartment that I was in as a kid. I think I was like 4 or 5, and they were, I think, from Bangladesh. And it's like, I just thought it was cool because they had, decorations and art and food that was different. I thought it was pretty cool. I didn't think, well, these people are below me or there's anything odd about it.
Yeah, that's the big contrast is the fact that I am a minority. But it seems like in America and in the West, minority has become synonymous with being of a person of color or an LGBT or a woman. But in South Africa, I am linguistically, culturally, and racially a very small minority. But at the same time, I'm told I have the most power of anyone in my country.
Yeah, and here's the litmus test. Do you feel remotely empowered in those surroundings? Probably no.
No. We have, I think, and I'm talking under correction, I think we have close to 188 race-based laws in South Africa.
Oh, wow. Jeez.
So yeah, no, it's a very strange country when you look at the dynamics, and especially now getting back to that point of importing an ideology from abroad, is that when these people use the same rhetoric and the same logic and the same ideology as, for example, campus activists in America, then they don't really take into account that they live in a completely different context. So, for example, yes, like you mentioned, the idea of white privilege might make sense to them in a white majority country, but how does that make sense in a country where whites are 8% of the population?
Yeah.
And are not in control of the government?
Yeah, but they'll still stick to it, though. They'll probably develop a globalized concept of whiteness and then ignore like populations and everything else. You say, well, yeah, but most of the richest countries are white, so you still have privilege even if you're homeless.
Yeah, man, but it's so frustrating. And I made this point, that group that organized that persons of color only supper, they made a tweet. I replied to the tweet. The absolute irony when your minds have been colonized by an ideology thought up by two foreign white dudes with beards, and my reply got more likes than their tweet.
Well, I'm not surprised. I think a lot of people in private oppose the sort of postmodernist, cultural Marxist stuff. It's just that they don't want the hassle of doing it very publicly. They'd rather do it anonymously or in privacy, I think. Yeah, I think we called it the Trump effect to some degree in 2016. I think there were a lot of people. It wasn't just poll missampling. Some of it really was a hidden Trump vote of people that didn't want to have to debate people for hours online or their own family or friends about why they would vote for the evil bigot, even though that's not how they saw the situation.
Yeah, but at the same time, that's the thing that frustrates me so much, is the fact that it's so clear to me to see where these people get all their logic and basically their judgment from. It's the social justice playbook, but at the same time they don't see it. They see themselves as this organic grassroots movement in South Africa. It's completely distinct from what's happening abroad. But at the same time, they spew the same types of mantras as these campus activists that you see in America.
Yeah, it's just like all the Marxists. They all think that they'll be the one that gets to be the high-tier party member that doesn't have to live by the miserable rules of the Stalinist regime that they seek. They want to be Joseph Stalin. They don't want to be someone who gets worked to death in a quarry 20 hours a day.
So we have a question from the chat. Thank you, Catherine, for bringing that to my attention. Can you ask Styx what he thinks of the use of a private, I think he's thinking militia, private militia for such things as securing the border or protecting farms? I'll ask also for my own curiosity about the use of such entities in protection of the Boer. So I think he's referring to a private militia or group that's used to protect the border, but also farms.
I think if a government has decided not to protect the border, especially in the context of the United States, it's a little bit different, because the thing is, the government under Obama specifically, and to some extent the latter days of Bush, I believe, if I remember correctly, simply was not imposing the law as it was passed. It was duly passed, constitutional and legally there. The executive branch had to enforce the law to guard the border along certain lines. They simply decided not to do so. In that case, where the government has decided to ignore its own legally passed laws, its own perfectly constitutional system, I'd say that private militias are fine. And if private groups that are under stress, if the government has decided to abandon them, if they're not being protected, they have every right to mass together to do that. Black communities have done that. There are now advocacy groups that are trying to get Black communities to purchase more firearms. And some people cynically referred to this and said, oh, well, they're criminals or something. And I said, no, I think it's a great idea that the Black community should have more guns. Actually, everyone in the country should. If the police aren't protecting them or they're abusing them, their local government's corrupt and not serving them, of course they have a right to arm themselves. They're American citizens. Likewise, I'd say anyone in the world who feels maligned or mistreated, especially by their own state, what would you do if it were a foreign army? well, you wouldn't, no one would even ask the question. Of course, you'd be able to defend yourself from a conquesting foreign nation. Why not if your own government's tyrannical? That's how half the American states were formed in the first place, including some of the socialist ones. They overthrew people with guns.
And also from a South African context, to also answer that same question, we had something like that in the late 90s and early 2000s called the commando system, where a lot of these farmers got together and they created a system where they protect each other's farms and respond to emergency calls and whatever. Yeah. But then, and this kind of feeds into the conspiracy theory that the government are also complicit or in some sense connected to the farmer, is the fact that they disbanded the commandos by order in the mid-2000s. Said it was all crimes should be left to the South African police force. You're not allowed to do this. And then the commandos got disbanded, and then farmers' stats shot through the roof.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's obviously a form of corruption. There's probably officials that like the fact that the farmers were going on. Some people might necessarily say, oh, it was probably like black nationalists. It was probably white nationalists because they would want more murders in order to justify their political platforms more locally and regionally. That can happen. It's like I question people like David Duke here in this country. Sometimes like the things that they say, they're so pandering. It's sort of like Al Sharpton or something for the black community he doesn't actually live in. He lives in a mansion or something. He pretends to be representing people that make like, 50 grand a year tops. There's no comparison between the two.
Yeah, that's the big hypocrisy in South Africa as well, is that all these politicians send their children to private schools, but then they always complain about the fact that the public schools are not in a good state. Our own Minister of Education described our education system as, and I quote, dysfunctional.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and we have schools.
At least they're willing to admit. Yeah, at least they're willing to admit there's a problem.
In South Africa, we have schools that don't even have textbooks. So, yeah, that's the big problem. And we have another question in the chat that's very good. Brian Duffy asks, is it also true that Israelis down in South Africa are now training white farmers? Yes, that is true. A lot of ex-Israeli Defense Force operatives are now down here in South Africa training farmers to help them defend themselves.
Well, that'll be helpful. They'll butcher a lot of people.
And I see he has another question. Is it true that the workplace in South Africa must represent the population of South Africa in terms of percentage breakdown in terms of race? That is also true. We have a mandate in terms of we have goals that set that the private sector needs to, within, I don't know the date, but like within the next 10 to 20 years, needs to represent the racial makeup of South Africa, which I just think is ridiculous. Rather give people...
Yeah, so if a white person was self-employed, like they had a lemonade stand, they would have to hire like 8 non-white workers.
Well, yeah, if
they decided to literally impose that to the letter of the law.
Yeah, it's not a law, so you wouldn't get any tenders or government benefits, and you'd pretty much be given a cold shoulder, and they'd make life really hard for you, but they can't force you to do it. So
that's so
at
weird.
The same time, but the interesting thing is, if that lemonade stand owner just runs the lemonade stand on their own, then there's no problem. But if they start hiring more people, then it needs to mirror the racial makeup of South Africa if they want any government benefits or help.
Is there a cutoff for really, really small businesses? Like you have to have 5 or 6 workers before that kicks in or something?
I think this only applies to bigger businesses that actually utilize government resources or like government help. But yeah,
that makes more sense, at least, if they're taking
but at the same time, the thing that really, I just want equality of opportunity, and then equality of outcome doesn't really matter. You just need, as long as the best person does the best in his job, then that's fine. But that's why we have an energy crisis at the moment, is that they fired a bunch of white engineers in Eskom, and now we have intermediate power outages.
So you're undergoing brownouts in the country because they basically pulled Mugabe Jr. on a single sector.
It's just malmanaged, and I just say in every few years we get an article about how Eskom, the national electricity provider, is in the shit now. They need a government bailout, and I'm like, you just need the P word. You just need fucking privatization. All this will go away. But no, that's not that. They don't do that.
Yeah, we have that problem here. Even China has that problem now. Their private sector, the components that they made hyper-capitalistic, I think outperform their centrally planned projects by what, 50% or 100%? It's an insane total.
But it makes sense. It makes sense that in the private sector, people want to make money. Therefore, they will do the best they can to please their customers. It's just, it's basic logic. And we have another question here that I think is very good. What are both of your thoughts on yesterday's Trending Times article, White Extinction Anxiety? Now, I think I actually saw Styx tweet out about this, so you can lead the way in terms of your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I pointed out that anxiety is very real in South Africa, not because there's an actual, sometimes people on the left, especially here, if you weigh in on it, like you make a YouTube video that says, well, you believe in white genocide, and that's literally, it's labeled a form of like anti-Semitism and stuff, even if it has nothing to do with that issue. I think the real worry, though, is the possibility that it happens because it's openly alluded to within the South African government. Here, most mainstream commentators, politicians, even the liberal ones, they don't actually come out and say, well, we need less white people, or we hate those Caucasian assholes or something. They simply don't do that. But you do have some people saying that. And then there are these others that are saying, oh, well, if you're worried about the fact that some hundreds of thousands or millions of very far left individuals actually do believe that, they are actually bitterly bigoted against anyone for happening to be white, you yourself are a problematic racist individual for even being concerned about it. I don't get the justification for it. It is still bigotry. Yes, it's not reverse racism. It is simply racism.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why I always tell people the idea of reverse racism doesn't exist. You should scrub that term from your vocabulary. It's just racism, pure and simple. And to answer that question myself, I honestly think that, like you said, the best example of white anxiety is in South Africa, where you are actually a minority. And that's why I always tell people, please pay attention. Because this is, if you want to preach the ideology of diversity and how great and perfect it is, just look at South Africa. It does, like we said at the beginning of the stream, there is a lot of benefits that you get from it, but at the same time, it also has a lot of baggage. It brings about a lot of tensions and things that you might not want in your community. And I tweeted this out the other day, and it's just an anecdote, is that the people that I know in my life that are the biggest supporters of open borders and mass immigration and diversity are all people that stay in gated communities and tweet from their yachts and who send their children to private schools. They don't have to deal with the ramifications of their vote.
That happens here too. Even these so-called generous liberals, we look at their tax rate as like Obama and Biden and all those people, despite making millions of dollars, they pay a tax rate that's lower than some people that make less than six figures. And it's like their kids go to private schools, and Obama's like, well, no, I'm going to send my daughters to a public school. Yeah, but they get deferential treatment. They're in the best classes with the best teachers. There's no problem. And if you needed to transfer them to a private school, you have the money for that. There's the real privilege. It's about money and about political power generally. It's not about someone's race.
That's the thing about privilege is context dependent. Even the richest man on earth has no privilege on a desert island.
Yeah. Well, yeah, he can take that money and he can line his thatched hut with it. Extra insulation.
He can make his fucking fire with it.
Yeah, he's got Tinder privilege.
He can build himself like a fucking sex bot out of the little fucking notes and get some components going. Maybe he can get a basic AI going that she can like say good morning and good night to him, whatever. But yeah, no, it's like I'm just picturing Elon Musk trapped on a fucking desert island. That man will definitely turn that island into a first world country. Give him like 3 years.
Yeah, he'll be using coconut. He'll be like the professor on Gilligan's Island, using coconuts to communicate with passing ships. Now he needs his Gilligan. It'll have to be George W. Bush. Only less funny.
While on the topic of Elon Musk, I do applaud his. He seems to be a bit more involved in terms of voicing his opinion on politics. He made a tweet the other day in terms of the irony of socialists all having no sense of humor, being boring people, and they go to high expensive colleges. And the left absolutely lost their shit at that fact that
and then he said, well, I'm a socialist too. I'm just pointing out a reality. He reminds me of a lot of the sort of Hollywood types that are supposedly red-pilled. Fundamentally, they're still like socialists or liberals. It's just that they seem sane by comparison. Like even Marr, he's saying, well, I pray for a recession. I pray that, Donald Trump jumps off a building and he says weird off-the-wall stuff. But at the same time, if he weighs in on religious zealots, he suddenly seems sane. Chuck Schumer's done that several times now. Like, other than immigration obstruction, for the most part, is arguably the sanest Democrat for many purposes, which isn't a great thing. But I mean, he's got a working mind. He's got a few neurons left that are firing. It's not like Maxine Waters or Kamala Harris. Hillary Clinton.
I've been a fan of Bill Maher for quite a while. Like, he does at least sometimes wander off the leftist reservation and speak some truth. So I'm definitely not as big a critic of his views. I don't want to see him fired. Like, that's the right playing the left's game, which I kind of am not in agreement with. I mean, just because...
Exactly. That's the worst possible thing. They weigh in on these things and they think that they're being smart or funny by saying, oh, the left demanded this person get fired, so we're going to do the same thing. It's like, no, you dolt. You're supposed to do the opposite thing.
You're going to
say, oh, look, we don't do the selective outrage thing. You're the only one that wants people deplatformed for saying something you happen to dislike.
No, that's the thing. It's that cliche Nietzsche quote of, when fighting monsters, be cautious that you don't turn into one yourself.
Yeah, don't gaze into that abyss.
Yeah, I'm seeing that on the right, and it worries me, the fact that they are playing the left's game, and it's going to turn them into the left eventually, and that's going to be the next paradigm shift. They're going to turn into the establishment, going to make the exact same mistakes, and then they're going to be overthrown.
And that's why Trump has an overwhelming advantage in 2020, and why the Democrats have to reform in order to even exist in the current paradigm, and they haven't done that yet. All of my political predictions are prefaced on that basic point, that because the paradigm is already shifted over, it's left the Democrats an epoch behind in cultural understanding and in political strategy. It's hilarious to watch. But then the right will, they'll eventually overstretch and fall prey to authoritarianism.
Now, this is a very important concept, the idea of a paradigm shift. Now, I'm pretty well familiar with it, but just for the people listening that might not be, could you just give us a little crash course in terms of what the current paradigm shift is all about and what it's prefaced on?
The current paradigm shift, as each successive generation grows a political consciousness, social consciousness of some sort, they'll always find problems with the current way in which things are done and go full anti-establishmentarianism. It's always happened. They're almost always more libertarian, or there's some sort of revolutionary fervor, some fascism, communism, something outside of the norm that's tried. And this happens on certain semi-predictable cycles. It's marked by social panic. Each successive older generation looks at the youth, usually, or the outsiders, whatever form they take, and says something about them scary. Like right now, it's the internet, too much free speech, the alt-right and the progressives, respectively, for the right and left. In the last generation, it was in the 80s, it was literally, heavy metal, Wicca, paganism, and atheism, things of a religious nature. And before that, it was communism, reds under the bed sort of social scare. When the paradigm has fully shifted over, the millennials have begun abandoning neoliberalism. Any group that remains like it was before, like establishmentarian, it can't possibly compete with a group that has modernized itself. The Republican Party here in the US has done that. They've become a populist movement. It is the party of Trump. They will always outcompete the Democratic Party unless the Democrats go full progressive or they find some other reform movement. It doesn't have to be a full overhaul, but it has to be changed.
Now, a bit of a segue, but it's a question that I get a lot on my channel, and I think maybe you can give an alternative perspective on it. So in 2019, South Africa has their official election, and a lot of, especially minorities in South Africa, don't know who to vote for, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of parties that really represent minority values or minority rights. Now, in the context of South Africa with land expropriation and basically a lot of racial tension and the direction that we are going, what advice would you give to the South African voter in terms of, should you just stay away? Should you do a shitpost vote for the fucking Cape Secessionist Party, or should he just vote for the lesser of the three evils?
Never vote lesser evils. Try to take one of the parties over or form a new one. I don't know. In South Africa, is there any like burdensome bureaucratic nightmare to actually filing candidacy if you're not part of one of those parties? Like, are there only certain parties that are legal?
No, well, just from my basic layman knowledge, I don't think there's any real barriers to starting a party. I think the big barrier is getting traction and getting support. That's the big thing.
Maybe you should form a libertarian constitutionalist movement or something. No, I'm serious. It could take off, especially in a country where government is already weaker, less centralized anyway. It wouldn't be that big a stretch. Something that doesn't want to steal land, and something that says, hey, maybe we need a little capitalism in this country. That might work. Look at China.
Now, from my common knowledge of the South African political climate, you're not really going to get that pro-capitalism platform to take off. We have a very strong anti-capitalist, anti-Western imperialism propaganda network in South Africa. So the media would firstly fucking destroy you. And secondly,
then you run against the media.
Because the other thing about, and that's why alternative media has not taken off as far as it could in South Africa, is the fact that a large portion of our population are still very rural. I mean, I've driven through the most rural areas of South Africa, and you just see houses and houses and houses. People staying on little hilltops, and they don't have internet. They don't read the newspaper. They live in very basic conditions. So they don't think about they'd rather spend that money they're going to spend on the newspaper or reading a book. They'd rather spend on money or on food just to keep themselves alive. So a very large portion of South Africans are not connected to information outlets. So you're going to struggle with, for example, alternative media or a more abstract or unorthodox party like a capitalist or libertarian party in a country like South Africa, if you really want to grow to a point where you can actually influence policy and influence the government.
So, well, then, yeah, you definitely have to abandon fiscal things in your platform. Just a libertarian party in the general moral sense then could work, though. Something that wants to restore more order and is just a generic anti-crime, sort of anti-corruption movement could actually take hold.
But you'd also have to have like a...
Yeah, at the very least, the media would have to talk about him if they had even a few % of the vote.
But you'd also have to have, and from my own perspective, a little bit of a populist stripe in you, because you'd have to be able to promise people that, well, firstly, you're going to deal with crime, you're going to provide jobs, and you're going to, and I think this is where the libertarian element comes in, you'll be able to promise them that we'll make sure that you're left the fuck alone. Yeah.
Unfortunately, if you make those promises and then don't complete them, your movement collapses in a single cycle.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, think of it this way, though. Like, you think of a group like UKIP. UKIP never achieved a majority vote almost anywhere in all of the UK. I mean, still a minor party, even though it got a larger share the last time around. But there still was a Brexit. No, but simply they brought the issue up. Sometimes all you have to do is bring an issue up in order to inject it into national politics. And you just have to structure it in such a way that all of the other larger parties are unable to address the question satisfactorily. That's what Trump did. Nobody was talking about immigration. So he just said, hey, I want to build a wall on the border and it'll be gold gilded and 100 feet tall and big and beautiful like me and like my hair. And nobody could counter it because they didn't actually plan on bringing it up at all, because they can't actually, they can't out-Trump Trump. That's why he goes all in and forms a false dichotomy in people's minds as a propaganda tactic, and it worked. He's still doing that now, and it's totally hoodwinked the media. I find it great. I don't even agree with most of his so-called platforms, because I know that he doesn't actually believe in 100% of what he says. It's a propaganda strategy. But I still think it's great and masterful.
But at the same time, now in a country like South Africa, where a lot of people don't have access to, for example, the internet or any real access to alternative media, I personally think the focus would rather be just to get the urbanites on board, in terms of the people that do have the access and the people that do have the ability to educate themselves. But at the same time, that's not going to work when your education system is basically fucking dysfunctional, in the words of our own Minister of Education. And of course, and this is what I always tell a lot of South African voters, is the fact that you do know the government is not going to give you the tools to overthrow them through public education, right? Like, they're not going to, they want the education system to be dysfunctional. That suits them, because then people don't think for themselves. Then people just accept their fate and just exist.
Yeah, it's harder to govern a more literate population because of their consciousness being higher. So it's easier to keep people, you know, ignorant and enslaved. They're trying to do that here. You can tell there's a reason why the neoliberals and the neocons have never made any significant effort to improve the education system. We peaked when the federal government was almost totally uninvolved around the 50s and 60s. Since then, there's been a steady backsliding, and each government keeps doing something stupid to try to fix it. Like you had No Child Left Behind from Bush. Well, it was actually No Child Left. No child left with their brain working, I suppose. Then you had Common Core from Obama, and that's even worse. He managed to take No Child Left Behind and make it worse somehow. And since then, I think between those two administrations, we felt, what, 8 or 10 slots in national rankings. I think we're not even in the top 20 anymore.
Wow, you're complaining about not being in the top 20. South Africa is rock bottom in terms of mathematics.
Yeah. No, I would have thought it was like maybe Somalia or something.
Yeah, no, we're down there at like the fucking bottom 20.
Yeah. So, no, don't worry. We'll be joining you pretty soon because of the globalists.
Yeah, and then we can all, the South Africans are just going to come online like, oh, what took you so long? Welcome to the party, guys. Yeah. We can help you. We can give you some tips on how to make your burglar bars match your electric fence.
Yeah, so today on things that I never knew existed until I left the state of Vermont.
Yeah, that's the thing about South Africa is people don't understand the immense level of, well, not immense, rather the deficiency of social trust, which I always say is one of the most valuable resources a society or community can have, is just trust. And South Africa, as a multicultural society, has a lot of trust issues in terms of you don't trust to just pick up a guy that's hitchhiking because he could climb into your car and fucking steal it. Or someone knocks on your door, you're not just going to open it and let them in and help them. We have a very serious issue when it comes to societal trust. And that, in my personal opinion, is a symptom of a society that's too divided in terms of racial and cultural lines and linguistically.
Yeah, here in Vermont, even that's happened in areas that are more developed, but outside of the cities, for the most part, it basically is like walking backwards into the 90s. Like I visited my old hometown, which is a small village of what 1,500 people, a couple of years ago after not having seen it since literally, you know, freshman year of high school, like almost 10 years. Didn't change at all. Nothing's been repainted. There's literally no difference at all, except I think one of the sidewalks had been, you know, remade. They like redesigned the way the sidewalks look in one section. It's literally it.
Well, one thing that everyone listening can look forward to, if South Africa collapses, there will be plenty of Styx videos just analyzing yet again another failure of socialism and just the empty promises that just didn't come to be. And then 5-10 years later, another country tries it because this time it'll work.
I predicted this. Be like you can also you can just become a refugee and go to Venezuela.
Yeah, I hear they skewered rats are to die for.
Yeah. Now, Maduro is definitely to die for. Lots of people are dying. I know a little bit of grave humor, but I mean, it's socialism. What am I supposed to do? There's no other humor to make.
Now, the interesting thing about the third world, and I've mentioned this earlier, is the fact that even if you defeat the scourge of socialism or social justice or all its little sub-compartments, feminism, whatever, even if you defeat it through the battle of ideas in America or the West, it's going to persist in the third world for decades to come. It's not going to be, you're not going to be able to weed it out here as quickly or effectively because of the education infrastructure and the lack of connection to the internet and just the mentality of people. If you have such a large portion of your population living in poverty, like I said, they'd rather spend their money on buying food than buying a book or educating themselves.
I am slightly more optimistic maybe than a lot of people that are sort of part of the alt media, sort of alt culture that's growing, because I see it beginning to spread. I think the fact that we're having this conversation and you happen to be South African shows me that there is a growth of sort of backlash and maybe a paradigm shift happening almost worldwide. Like I think it's definitely spread well beyond the first world. It'll probably hit Venezuela. Maybe Venezuelans will overthrow Maduro and become hyper capitalistic or something tomorrow. It could actually happen. just because somebody made a Twitter post or something. I mean, it already saved, like, the nation of Tunisia is still marginally developed and kind of stable, specifically because of a bunch of college kids organizing on Facebook. So yeah, that gives me some degree of hope for the world, I think.
Yeah, I see a troll with a purpose in the chat said, the small town I grew up in doubled in size and now it's a suburban hellscape.
Yeah, that's happened in a lot of places, but here the population's declining, so that won't happen. Here we've got the opposite problem of everyone is too old and homogenous, and there's, like, there's nothing to do for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's basically stagnated in terms of new ideas and new perspectives. One of my favorite Afrikaans philosophers, MP van Wyk Louw, said, just as important as the circulation of blood to the body, as important is the circulation of ideas for a people. And that's why freedom of speech is so important, because if you cut off that circulation, then you're going to rot. Your body is just going to waste away. Yeah,
it's definitely true.
And I see Rex W in the chat as well. Caracal and Styx at the same time. Yes, please. Good to see you here, man. Yeah, no, this is it's been an incredibly interesting chat, and I think in a few minutes our time's going to be up, and then I'm going to let Styx go on his merry way. But another question that I had before you go is the idea of, can you, and you love your predictions, but do you think South Africa is just going to go as the far right predicted in terms of a race war, and then it's going to completely collapse and go the way of Zimbabwe or Venezuela? Or do you think there's a little glimmer of hope you can give to people? You can be as morbid as you want. This channel is not for being sugarcoating the facts.
I won't sugarcoat it. There's going to be a long struggle ahead for a lot of people. It's not going to be broken down just by race. A lot of people who are black will suffer a lot too. But it delves into just general government corruption. The population of people that would be impacted in South Africa is considerably larger than a few thousand farmers living under Mugabe's dictatorship. I think that it would be a different scenario. No, I don't think that there's going to be mass genocide or anything. I honestly think there are those who want it. There are those who might attempt it, but I don't think it'll actually end up happening. I think it'll be successfully fought against, which is optimistic, I think.
Yeah, the big difference that I see between South Africa and Zimbabwe is the fact that the Zimbabweans, the Zimbabwean farmers, when they were dispossessed of their land, they could run to South Africa. They had an outlet. They had somewhere to go as a plan B. But in South Africa, we're the last outpost of basically just a functioning society if you exclude Botswana. The people in South Africa have nowhere to go. And for example, let's take the 4.5 million white South Africans. You're not going to be able to evacuate them all in terms of a refugee program. And the vast majority of them, because a lot of people always tell me, why don't you just leave? And I tell them, no, the vast majority, I'd say about 90% of South Africans do not have the means to leave. I think it costs, like, you need a pool of capital in the range of like 6 million rand to really make even an attempt to emigrate and make a success of it. And then on the other side of the coin, it's not just about means, it's also about will. A lot of South Africans, especially Afrikaners, that is my culture, they're not going to leave. They're not going to leave their farms. They've been living on those farms for hundreds of years. Those farms have been in their possession, in their family's possession for 10, 12 generations. Their family members are buried on that farm. You're not going to take that from them. They're going to probably die there, if in the case of a violent confiscation.
Yeah, and that's to be expected. The thing is, though, in such a breakdown situation where most of the farmland ends up going fallow and order begins to break down into civil war, at some point somebody gets involved. It probably wouldn't be the world community, but other nations locally might get involved. That could happen. In this day and age, because of the instantaneous global nature of information transfer and communication, you could imagine the possibility of a crowd-funded military intervention whereby a bunch of mercs and militias from other places just can descend on South Africa to restore order unilaterally without the blessing of any particular state. And wonderfully, in a lot of nations, it's actually legal for people to do that. Like, there's no specific law in the United States against doing so. You can travel abroad and you can't fight for America's enemies, but if it's not a fight America itself is part of, it wouldn't matter. There's no actual specific law against it whatsoever unless you're engaged in war crimes.
And Adherent of Lady Columbia asks, what are your guys' thoughts about the upcoming decade? 2010s have sucked, excluding post-mid 2016. What are your thoughts about the 2020s and the future of main political issues of that time?
Yeah. I think you see a rise continuously in both the further left and right and libertarian movements, the death of neoliberalism in most parts of the world. It'll be revived in some form in some places, but it won't be powerful anymore. And I think globalism will be pushed back in favor of something which is just globalized, which is like everyone has their identity, as long as their demographics change, but nothing else really does. But I'm more or less optimistic, and hopefully music gets better. I will say that.
I hope you're right, man. And my own answer to that question would be that you just have to look at history. Things pretty much stay the same in terms of human history. If you go farther enough, you give enough steps back. Human generations have a very short memory. So you have one generation that learns the horrors of communism and collectivism and authoritarianism, and then their children kind of have just a little bit of that same sentiment because they were told by their parents. But then the third generation, their children have no idea, and they make the same mistakes. And then the generation after them sees the mistakes, and then the whole cycle just keeps on going. So I don't believe in the fact that we're on a constant linear system of progress, where we are constantly just learning more and improving. I think we step in the same shit every few generations because of our short memories.
Yeah, I'd be more worried at this point about the 2030s than the 2020s as far as shit hitting the fan in most parts of the world, though.
Yeah,
I think for the vaguely longish term, I think I'm generally optimistic. After the next couple of years, we have more struggle to go through. Then we hit sort of a decade, 2 decades of peace and prosperity. Then things go back to the way they were.
Right, and we're now approaching the end of our stream. So now I'm going to give the mic over to Styx just so he can give final thoughts in terms of what we've discussed today and what to expect from the future, and maybe any trivial other facts or thoughts that he'd like to leave the audience with, and then I'll give my final thoughts, and then we'll sign off. Hopefully Styx signs off with his signature slogan.
Oh, of course, you know it. I would say, first and foremost, thank you again for having me on. It's actually been really fun. It's interesting because I've never really had an in-depth conversation, this way with anyone from South Africa. It's interesting to know a little bit more about things. One little thing in passing that I would mention as we were talking, actually less than 1,000 subscribers to go now officially until the big 250,000 for my own channel. So yeah, while we were live, that actually happened. It ticked over there to 249.
Oh, that's great, man. That's progress. Yeah. That's something tangible.
But yeah, I had a great time. I hope we can talk again soon.
Yeah, no problem, man. If you ever want to have like someone on, or just want to talk to someone in terms of what's happening in South Africa, if things get more heated and hectic in the future, I think the roller coaster is just starting. You can send me a DM. I'll definitely make a plan. But then the final thoughts that I want to leave people on is the fact that, and it gets back to the purpose of this channel, is the idea of you need to be open to different ideas. You need to give people platforms, even if you don't agree with them completely. Like I've been trying so hard to get, for example, an Antifa member or a rabid leftist or a Marxist on here. And I can give them the assurance that I'm not going to grill them. I'm not going to try to humiliate them. I want to hear what you have to say. I might not agree, but I'll give you your airtime, and you can espouse your views to your heart's content, and that'll be it. And the audience can decide whether your ideas have merit. But I haven't had any fish bites as of yet. So that's the thought I want to leave on.
Yeah, that tends to happen to people on that side of the spectrum.
Yeah, that's the thought I want to leave people on, is the idea of don't get caught up in an echo chamber. Don't think just because you were part of the counterculture at the beginning, you found the right way now, and this is going to be the current zeitgeist is going to persist. And just because you are right now, it's not going to just crumble in the future where the paradigm shifts. So that's the thing that I want to leave on, is the idea of stay open-minded, always question everything. Please think critically. Don't just eat up everything. Don't just believe anything anyone says, even if it's one of your trusted sources. I always tell people, don't believe what I say, research what I say. And that's what I want to leave on. So thanks again, Styx, for coming on. This was an incredibly good chat, and I immensely enjoyed it. The chat seemed to enjoy it very much as well. And I look forward to having more similar streams with similar guests in the future as well. This is an ongoing project, Conscious Caracal and the stream of consciousness in general. So I hope to be much bigger in terms of subscribers and following in the future. But yeah, at the moment, I'm not making any money off it. I mean, it's just my hobby. So I have no like sponsors or people that are pulling the strings in the background. So I can just say whatever the fuck I want. So yeah, no, thanks for coming on, Styx. Yeah. And can you just do your signature?
Yep, that's about all. Peace out.